Hi there. Thanks for having me. I appreciate this. As he said, my name is Michael Cuba. I wear a lot of hats. I don't know if you've been reading what's up there, but I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what else I do in addition to dendrochronology. A hat that I've worn for a very long time is I am a board member with the Timber Framers Guild, which is a national nonprofit organization which teaches people about timber framing practices, both historic and modern. The Guild has a school, the Heartwood School, which is in New Hampshire, though somewhat portable. We do take it on the road, and I am an instructor at the Heartwood School as well. I also serve on the boards of the National Barn Alliance, Historic Barn and Farm Foundation of Pennsylvania, Haycock Historical Society, and Hans House Studio, which does some interesting traditional construction projects all over the world. But why we're here today is to talk about the Oxford Dendrochronology Laboratory. That's who I work with, and I have to credit a number of the slides in the presentation did come directly from the fellow I work for, Dr. Daniel Miles at the Oxford Lab. So I shouldn't get credit of all the ingenious slides that I have to share, but I did have permission to share them with you today. So at this point, you've all heard a little bit about the gist of dendrochronology. Dendrochronology was developed, believe it or not, over a century ago in, believe it or not, Arizona, of all places. An astronomer developed the science of dendrochronology, that is, studying or analyzing weather patterns in tree rings to study climate over time. And predominantly, most of the people that you'll meet with all the dendrochronologists that you're going to meet, most of them are doing climate science and climate study. Very few people are using it to examine artifacts. Some people refer to it as dendroarchaeology. There are people who specialize in looking at shipwrecks. There are people who look at art. Mostly, I do architectural dendrochronology. We have, on occasion, dated things like panel paintings. But the gist of it is we are looking at patterns of growth in tree rings to determine wet years and dry years, and look at patterns over time and see if we can take a sample from an existing structure and match it to databases and regional chronologies that are developed. So to start off, I want to talk a little bit about wood, what it is, how it works. I'm sure everybody's familiar with trees. We're looking at the rings. So you expect generally that every year a tree in our climate is going to put on a new ring. There are exceptions. It doesn't always happen that way. And for that reason, we look at certain species more than others. Particularly, we really favor oak. Oak works very well, in part because the rings will start growing in the beginning of the season, even before they start to leaf out. So if you've got a dry year where it's not going to be a very big ring, at the very least, oak will put on the early wood. And so here you can see, this is an example of, actually this is one of the oaks. Oak is known as ring porous, so you can see from here to here is an annual growth ring. This early part where you're looking at these big pores, this is the early part in the spring wood. Later in the summer, you get this later wood. You're looking at structural properties of wood. The strength of oak is really derived here from the late wood. The spring wood is not quite as strong. So what I'm mapping is this distance here on each tree ring. And I should point out, I added this slide last night. Here's pine, and it looks quite a bit different. And you can see here on this side, I think this is probably ash, where A is, that's the early wood. And you see that over here where the pine is, A is also the early wood here, B is the late wood. So they don't all grow the same way. Every time you're looking at a different species of tree under the microscope, you're looking for different details in the wood. But anyway about it, we're looking from A to the end of B to define an annual growth ring. And as you can see, there are different kinds. So Oak is ring porous, which for me, under the microscope, makes it really easy to identify. I can see where that ring started. And I'm sure you can notice this line here that defines the beginning and the end of that annual ring. It's a little faint. It's not quite as obvious or easy to see. So there are diffuse porous woods like maple that are not quite as easy to read. In this case, we're looking at something where you've got ideal large rings and they're easy to identify. If you have several dry years in a row, you're going to be looking at really tiny rings. It's very difficult to parse them out, to pull them apart. Typically, if I can, I'm looking at things at about 10 times magnification, and that's probably what this photograph was taken at. You can go up to about 40, but the closer you look, the more then you're just looking at the cells, and when we're measuring these things, we really want to look at an average of where that growth ring begins and ends. One of the things that I want to point out is you think of the heart of the tree as being right in the center. Often it isn't. You can get what they call reaction wood, particularly here. I see this beautiful river right outside. Trees that are growing on the banks of the river have to react to get themselves righted if they are starting to move or if there's prevailing wind that's pushing on the trees, and they'll react in different ways. So hardwoods will react by putting on extra growth in tension. Softwoods, just the opposite, they put on extra growth to resist those forces in compression wood. And so in theory, the rings here and their ratio of growth from one to another versus the opposite side where you've got this buildup of reaction wood, the ratios should be the same, but they aren't always. And so this is what makes this a little complicated when I go into somebody's house and I'm looking for what to take, where to take it from. I'm trying to find something that really represents an average of growth, and you'll see distortions. Right. So this is how we build up regional chronology, but I brought toys and props today, so I'm passing stuff around. Oh no, I still have to have a microphone? That's terrible. I thought by wandering around I could get away from this. And I'll send this one around. This is a piece of pine, just so you can see by comparison how different it is. When I take the cores, they come out like that before they get prepared. And everything that I'm passing around is mostly things that I've rejected that I don't think looked good enough. These are local as well. These are from Krista Eastgate's, just down the street. And in spite of having whole sections of log to work with, I discovered that there really weren't enough rings to make that useful. I could stand down here. I might do that. So what we do when we take samples like this and we're trying to correlate them to a regional chronology is we have to start with a living specimen. You can't start with, somebody says, our house was built in 1799. We're sure of it because it's in the documentary record. Why don't you just take a slice of our newel post and base everything in the town off of that? It doesn't work that way. So you have to start with a living sample. And generally, this is hordes of graduate students in agricultural extension programs and universities that are going out with increment borers, taking samples out of live specimens and measuring them. So you're verifying that the tree is alive, so you know the actual date of that outermost ring. And then you will measure each ring, and then you will correlate or match each sample to the other, to the other, to the other. And for every ring where they align, so they may be trees that have, one tree might have 300 rings, another tree might have 400, but for the rings that they share in common, you'll add those measurements and then divide by the number of samples to kind of cut out on some of that chatter and noise. So where we were looking before at where you've got the reaction wood, that's that sort of chatter that you want to cut down on. What we're looking at is not actually the measurements, but the ratios of growth from one year to the next. And when we're building a regional chronology, you want reasonable overlap. So the way that this is depicted would make you think if you've got 10 rings of overlap, that's enough. That's not quite science. Ideally, you're looking for a minimum of 80 or maybe 100 rings. But doing this, we've been able to get back thousands of years in all different parts of the planet, any place where anybody's been doing this kind of research. And part of the reason that it goes back so far is that people are looking at climate study. So those of us who are looking at it in the architectural context are sort of the side beneficiaries of this. For those of us that do this kind of work, we rely on the foundations that were laid down by statisticians who came before us. Anybody remember statistics class? Wow. Okay. You know students' t-value? There's something called the student's t-test that everybody gets beat up with in statistics class. There's a modified version of this. It was modified by two Irish statisticians, Bailey and Pilcher. And that's the math. And I always put this up just in case anybody dares ask me how this is done. You can do the math for yourself and verify it. Somebody else has thought this through. Somebody else has given us this math. But suffice it to say, this is the important part here. This t-test yields a result, and so we are looking at values of 3.5 or greater are considered statistically significant if you have a sample that's got 80 rings or more, and that's how much of a match you have. And that is, the suggestion is that you will have a 1 in 1,000 chance of having a spurious result. Before I started doing the work on the laboratory end of it, I imagined that you don't see these spurious results very often. I have lots of samples that will give you t-values of greater than 3.5 at several different years. So it's not necessarily all cut and dry. It doesn't always work out so cleanly. English Heritage in England developed a baseline. We need to be at least at this number to consider it worth reporting. Anything below that shouldn't be reported. So if you had something with 50 rings at a value of 3.5, you're not supposed to share it. You're not supposed to guess your way there. You need to meet a certain threshold. So when I go into a house, unfortunately like yours, Amy, the rings weren't there for me to be confident that I was going to get results that would truly be statistically significant. But here, essentially what we're doing with these chronologies is matching up the samples with a regional chronology. And here you can see where they're reasonably well aligned. They're not perfectly aligned because they grew at different locations. They had different soil types. They may have been on a different slope of a hillside or a different side of a house. So there's going to be some variation, but generally we expect the highs and lows of the major dry periods and wet periods are going to align well, and then down below you can see that 1 year off where it doesn't match that well. This is always everybody's favorite slide. Just kidding. I have to throw these in. So when we're testing samples, we'll test against multiple chronologies. And generally, we'll sample a house, we'll take 10 samples per phase of construction. So if your house was built in 3 phases, you want to date all 3 phases. We're going to take 30 if we're able to get 30 viable samples. Then with each phase, we're going to make a site master. We're going to take all the matched rings within a given phase, add them together, and divide them. and then that becomes a mean or a master. And we run that master against regional chronologies. So some of them may be large regional chronologies, others may be confirmed matches on other structures. So everything you see to the left indicates each line is a different chronology. The date span that you see next to it is the span that the samples from that chronology cover well. And I should note that the beginning date and the end date shouldn't mislead you or give you the thought that this house was necessarily built in 1690. It may have been built before that. There could be repair material, there could be introduced material, there could be material that's reused that gives some of the earlier dates. Next to that, you see the overlaps here, this line here. How many rings are you overlapping by? So down here, we see a 54, 47, 47. Those you could probably disregard. But here, what we're looking at is all of the t-values come up over 3.5. And you see here, you have statistically significant matches with very different dates. But now we have a cumulative t-value down here where everything else matches at 1713 for this particular structure. So if I'm running samples on a given house, we're not looking at one chronology. My default is about 450 different chronologies. I'm not doing the work. I'm just pressing a button and the computer's doing the number crunching. So we'll see how many matches we get. The way that we do the work is with a little borer. These are custom made in the lab at Oxford. And the borer is hollow. The outside diameter is about 5/8 of an inch, and that'll give you the 1/2-inch diameter core that you saw being passed around. And it won't center itself, so you have to add a little template on. And we are looking for bark edge. So you don't need the bark to be present, but you need the outermost ring of the tree at the time that it was cut down. And with that, if we get a match, because we don't always, but if we get a match, we should be able to give you the season of the year that the timber was felled. Knowing construction practices in the United States early on, generally most things were built when the timber was still green. It's easiest to work, and usually there was a bit of a rush order on the timeline. People wanted to get into their home or start using their barn. So generally you expect that the timbers are cut down and within a few years the house should be built. We do find sometimes where you'll get a span, which is another good reason to not take a single timber. We'll look at some examples of that later where you get several different years in succession in a single structure. This is what the coring bits look like up close. And once you've got the samples, you prepare them on, it's essentially a linisher or a belt sander that's sort of stationary and upside down. And you start off with 80 grit, being mindful of your fingers. Lost a couple of fingernails. And you work your way up to 1,000 grit. You want to get a really high polish on it. And here you can see a little bit, if you squint, there's slashes and dots. And we'll see some of that later. The first thing we do after we get these things polished up, you put them under the microscope and you count off. So I'll make a slash at the first ring with a tiny, tiny little marker. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, make a dot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, make another slash. So that shows me where the 5s and 10s are. So when I'm doing the actual measuring, it measures, the output comes in lines of 10. If a line of 10 doesn't align with one of those slashes, I've made a mistake somewhere. And so this stops me from making a mistake that's more than 5 rings so that I can catch it and correct it. This is what the rig looks like that I use for the analysis. It's a pretty basic microscope that sits on a stand. There is this tool down here. It's called a stage. And the stage can travel back and forth. On the left-hand side of it, there's a little knob that makes that stage move back and forth. And on the back of it is a tool called a linear encoder. And that is measuring the distance that the stage moves in microns. So you align a crosshair in the microscope with the first ring. You zero it out. This little unit over here shows me real time what the measurements are, and then it sends the signal. You can see there's a graph on the computer behind it. And you can see here, my right hand, I've got two buttons. I'm never really looking at them. You know where they are. The one that's close to you sends the measurement. The one that's far clears it if you need to. So sometimes you'll make an adjustment. You'll move the table until it lines up under the crosshairs. You'll zero it out. Then you'll make the measurement, and then you'll send it. This is a photo I took just using the iPhone, looking down through the microscope. And that's roughly what I'm staring at all day. So my particular microscope is a trinocular head, so there's a camera on it so that I can share this with the lab that I work with in England. If you look, you can see here's a dot, here's a slash, here's a dot. So it gives you a sense of the rhythm of the rings. And it'll vary within the same piece. You'll find really tight spots and really broad spots. There is another tool that we use on occasion for really delicate samples. So if we're coming into your house and you've got 8x8 timbers, then we're not so worried about taking something that's 5/8 of an inch. If that concerns you, watch an electrician or a plumber for 5 minutes. You'll be less concerned. But for priceless artifacts, there is a micro borer that we use, and that thing gets set up stationary. This is the tool, and so you have to mount it to something and essentially direct it toward the piece that you're going to sample. And that's about the size of the core that you get out with a micro borer. What we're looking at here is an example. This is the door of the Pyx chamber at Westminster Abbey, which is, as far as we know, it's the oldest dated Saxon door in England. And you can see on top that by using this micro borer, they were able to go through a couple of panels, get multiple samples. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different samples. And then they were able to average that together. Something that they are able to do in England that we're not able to do here is to use averages with sapwood. So we've got sapwood and heartwood. Heartwood is at the center of the tree. That's the part that's more rot resistant generally. The sapwood is closer to the living tissues of the trees. Usually in some place like England, where you've got a limited number of oak species and sort of limitations on how varied the climate is, they're able to make a provision that if you see a distinct boundary between the heartwood and the sapwood, you can make an estimate of how many years, of a range of years that it might fall into if you don't have complete sapwood. Our climate is so varied, and the number of oak species and the soil conditions and whatnot. Here, we have no such provisions, and we probably never will. But that doesn't mean that all hope is lost. So one of the new frontiers is isotopic dendrochronology. This is something that has been developed with the fellow I work with in England, Dan Miles, and others at the University of Swansea in Wales. So rather than measuring one ring to the next, to the next, to the next, it doesn't always work. For a couple of reasons. One, you might not have enough rings. Two, if you have some sort of weird environmental perturbation, you've got an infection or something like that, and you get a big fat ring in the middle of your sequence where you can't guess your way across it. One thing that we know is consistent year to year is the relationship of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16. So it's the same sort of process where people have actually figured out year by year by year what those relationships look like. And so this is the two main problems that it solves. Disturbed growth, and you can see here you've got a lot of distortion in the rings. You've got some tight rings here, but some really big ones there. Those pieces that I was passing around, the ones that say side of the road in New Jersey, about an inch from the sapwood, you can see where there's a lot of distortion in the growth rings. This up on top, what they call complacent fast growth rings, is a condition where, say you've got a tree species that always grows in wet places, always wet. So there's not enough differentiation in the growth of the tree from year to year to year to really get a pattern of highs and lows and dries and wets. But if you are comparing those oxygen isotopes, you can. It's a little more expensive than what I do. And it involves, again, another team of graduate students. And what they would do is for each ring, cut the rings, isolate them, remove the early wood, the spring wood from the ring, and then they would grind up the late wood of each year individually, put it into a mass spectrometer, and use that to measure that ratio, and then they rebuild that sequence. We don't have it in the United States yet, but we are looking for interested funders. So if anybody has a mass spec lab, tens of millions of dollars, call Oxford. And at this point, this is a little dated. We're back in 2019 where the program was roughly in its infancy. And you can see there are a couple of sites. There's 3 in Wales here. There's another in Scotland, 2, and then 3 in England. And they've certainly multiplied that out many times over at this point. One of the nice things about this isotopic dendrochronology is that using isotopic dendrochronology, they've been able to independently verify results with traditional dendrochronology and vice versa. We have solid results from traditional dendrochronology. We take those old samples, mash them back up, and try the dendro-iso on it. So it's developing very well in England and probably more through Europe. Here's an example. This is in Shropshire. This is one that they were not able to date with conventional dendrochronology. And you can see here is a result that this dotted line is that 3.5 t-value threshold. And you can see that there is something that comes above that line at about late 1600s. Here, with the isotopic dendrochronology, they were actually able to conclusively date that house to 1368. If anybody is fascinated by the isotopic dendrochronology, there's a wonderful program that Historic England had put out on Gwyn Kiln. I'm sure I'm butchering that and I can't speak Welsh. But this was a fascinating structure dating to the early 1400s that there was just lots of speculation for centuries of research on this place, and they weren't able to nail it down. But using the isotopic dendrochronology, they came up with a date of 14 to 18 on that one. And you can see they're still using the t-values. It's the same method. And they're at a t-value of 6.3, which is clearly statistically significant. Here's a fun example of how and why dendro can tell you about the history of a structure over time. This is Salisbury Cathedral. At the time that the slideshow was put together, it said over 600 samples taken. I think we're probably well over 700 at this point. They just kind of keep going and going and going. 22 independent phases of construction have been identified in this. And you can see here where it started off. If you look at the bottom of the screen, 1222 is where it started. Then 1234, 1242. And you can see the evolution of the structure over time. And then what it's also enabled us to do is look at various phases of repair. And we know who did or who is credited to have done certain repair phases. So here in particular, people wanted to be able to distinguish what are the things that Christopher Wren did, what are the things that Francis Price did, and they were able to demonstrate this conclusively. This shot, boy, I love this. We were here last April. This is looking up into the spire, and that scaffold in the inside of that spire has been the source of endless debate among historians in England. It is not over. I have gotten sucked into that debate. I don't feel like I have much to offer, but I don't think that debate is going to be concluded anytime soon because not every part of it has been datable, but there has been a question about chickens and eggs. Which parts came first? Which parts followed? Which parts might have been repairs? Let's get local. Some of you may recognize Benita's house. This is one that gave us a little head scratching. This is the main body of the house. And I think, again, architectural historians had a lot of speculation about what was going on here and how old it might have been. And in spite of how long I've been at it, I was thrown off by this one too. A few years ago, Benita was having some work done to the house. I wish I had seen it when it was exposed like that. That really is the best opportunity to take the samples. And some of the samples that got passed around are ex situ samples that came from this material that was packed into the walls. So fortunately, that material was retained. I was able to take slices off of that material, and that helped a lot. Benita's house is one where the growth rings were really fast. I was having a tough time there. The first timber that I went after was an 8x8. I counted 36 rings. 55 is my bare minimum threshold. And so I had sort of put the brakes on and called it off and said, I don't think we're going to be able to do this. Dan Miles came over from England. He had a look at it. And he said, well, if you try here, here, and here, maybe. And Benita decided to take the risk. And we did have success and also surprise. And you can see here our felling dates are winter 1783-84. Part of the reason that it says 83-84 is we can't distinguish between December and January. It's simply a period where there's no growth. But we couldn't tell you which side of the year it actually falls on. This here is just down the road that way. You could walk to it. This is Krista Eastgate's house. And this material here had been removed from the floor. And this was an opportunity to try to date this back section of the house. This is a kitchen wing here that has two separate cook hearths. And is a bit of a curious structure. I moved very quickly to sample this because the material was left outside. If it gets wet, probably not going to sample well. So that's one of the things that we're looking for. We want the sapwood to be intact. It's particularly vulnerable to insect damage and moisture damage. So as soon as this was outside of the house, I wanted to move really quickly to get those samples. Two of those samples got passed around, and again, they were sort of fast grown, and I wasn't able to use them. This is ultimately, so these were the pieces that I got. I took a chainsaw and just cut off the ends, sliced off the ends of the timber, put them on a bandsaw, cleaned them up, polished them up. And so I did A's and B's. And so the A's and B's are from the same timber. You can see here, you've got a heart that's slightly off center. It means that there's a little bit of reaction wood. So what I did with A's and B's was I'd take a sample from here, a sample from there, measure them each, match them together, add them together, divide them by 2. Then we get a master for each one. And we did have success here. It is winter of 1833-34, which certainly seems to coincide with a lot of activity on this street. Another local project that we did a few years ago. Does anybody know this house? This is Homestead Farm up on top of the hill in Lambertville. It's my understanding that Lambertville was largely hewn from this property. And there were lots of questions about the provenance of this house and just how old it was. And when looking at the house, we were really struggling to find samples that we thought were going to date well. And these are the samples that I got out of it. And we did get a date, 1755-56, that winter. And you can see that several pieces dated and dated well. But to do that, I went after the corn crib outside, which is a remarkable structure, and that turned out to be the spring of 1762. That had really nice wood in it. And even better still is the barn on that property, which we were able to date to winter 1763-64. And sometimes what we do is we go onto a property, somebody says, I want the house dated. I say, you don't really have good material here in the house. If I can date the barn well to a regional chronology, I might be able to date the house to a barn. So sometimes we'll scoop up a couple of structures if somebody's willing and date several. to help strengthen the matches. In this particular region, we've done a couple dozen, so we have a lot of data really locally that we can work with. But you can see these are the tables for those three on that same property. The house itself is relatively low with the t-values, but still passable at 3.76 to 6.1. The corn crib does a little better at 4.85 to 7.12. And then the barn, as I suspected, dates here shown from 6.8 to 10.75. Anytime you're approaching 10, you're almost at the same tree. So that's a really, really strong match. So that kind of illustrates that strategy and why you would do it. This is also local headquarters farm. We see lots of houses with date stones. Sometimes those stones match. Sometimes they don't. We'll get to that later. Does anybody know Roger Byram? A great fellow, owns this house. And he was curious. He was a little skeptical about the date of the house. And then when we came back to him with a date that matched the date stone, he said, "Are you sure?" Yeah, we're sure. That one matched well enough. Again, with particularly high matches, which is what we're looking for. This is maybe the first or second house that I had ever done. This is the Comfort Star House in Guilford, Connecticut, and it has long been believed to date from 1646. Architectural historian Albert Lowell Cummings used to bring his classes there from Yale and long suspected that this house might be about 50 years later. We discovered that he was just about spot on and dated that house to 1695. It does have lots of details that you wouldn't expect to see that late, particularly here. I don't know if you could make it out, but there's a cross-hatching pattern here. It's called pargeting, and sometimes we'll see it as a decorative element on exterior plasters, but it's rare to see it on the interior of the house. But this is an original detail of that Comfort Star house. That's what it looked like when it was unsheathed in early to mid 20th century. You can see some nice first period details and nice matches with several samples. This is in the same town. It's the Highland House Museum. It was believed to be about 1690 and turned out being just about 1712, 1713. More often than not, no matter how strong the documentary evidence, almost everything ends up being later than people think. We did a house in Wallingford, Connecticut that they still assert is 1667. It's a museum. It is 1735. No ifs, ands, or buts. And they don't seem compelled to come clean. I just dated another house in Connecticut, also believed to be 1666. It is 1746, and no one would guess. Every historian in the 20th century who studied that house has been fooled. The numbers don't match. And what's good about this dendrochronology work is it tells you where to look in the documentary record when you do get a result. This is one I did just a couple of years ago. This is historic Rittenhouse Town in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. It was conveniently, they've dated it for us. This is right over the door. They were looking for further corroboration on this. They had early dendrochronology work done by Ed Cook at Columbia University. There just wasn't a lot of material in the structure. But one of the things that we really struggled with at this particular property is, you see it says bark, yes, and he means bark edge. So only one of the samples there actually had bark edge. And you also see it says structural beam. That's kind of ambiguous. So that doesn't help you identify which structural beam that dated to. But he did manage to get several other samples that didn't have complete bark edge. And I believe what he was doing at this time was trying to develop a regional chronology. And Philadelphia is particularly difficult because you've got water right there. And this is the same here, being right on the Delawares. Sometimes you can get microclimates that really throw you off a little bit. It can be difficult to read through the chatter. This second chronology that he lists here, though, is what we call a floating chronology. where you see this one here, Bark Edge, yes, dated 0. So he doesn't have a date on it, but he has matched these other 3 to it. 1 less 16 rings, less 9, and less 19. So we call those floating chronologies. If at some point in the future somebody is able to get more data and date what, I think he called it a lentil. I don't think that's what he meant. But if that lintel were to be dated, then these other ones subsequently could be dated. So it is possible, if you don't date something right off, that as more data becomes available, you might be able to date something in the future. At this point, we're pretty well covered in the Northeast, so there's not a lot of expectation that if something didn't date, that it's going to. These were a couple of samples that we got out of that same structure, out of the addition next to it, and we were able to corroborate that the addition was built in 1753 and 4. I threw this slide in just to note how important the documentation work is. When you looked at that last report about Rittenhouse Town, it said structural beam. Well, I don't know what that is or where that is. Here, you've got each timber indicated, and these red details are where the individual cores came from. So they're numbered. So if they come out with different dates, you'll know, well, the ones with this date came out in this section, and the ones with those dates came out in that section over there. This is maybe the most fun one of all. This is my wife in Virginia, and I live in this house. We bought it a couple of years ago, and it had a date stone conveniently located, and it told us when the house was from, 1776. And we had a complete documentary record going back to the original deed from the property, which was 1768. And so at that point, you wouldn't think that there's much reason to look back beyond that, but I figured since I do this for a living and I try to convince other people to part with their money, that I should do the same and do a little experimentation and see if we can get a confirming date for this house. And so here you can see what we found in the documentary record. This piece right over here is actually part of the original petition for that property. And we were able to find really good paperwork on this property. This is 1798 direct tax, depending on where you live. This was well adhered to, particularly northern Bucks County. You'll get for each property what structures were there, what were they made out of, how big were they, what were they valued at, which is good when you're looking for 18th century structures in the region. If it's not listed on that 1798 direct tax, probably isn't from then. Although I will note the measurements are off a lot. The standardization of units and measures and the surveying didn't match up that well all the time. And I have the feeling that some people may have been downplaying the actual dimensions of their properties for tax purposes. Not that I'm endorsing that. And you can find agricultural surveys and censuses, which told us a lot about how the property was used. We know who was living there at what different times and what structures were on the property. We were able to find the Bible from the family that is credited with building the house is in the Mercer Museum. We were able to paw through that. We found their gravestones. So we thought this was pretty well locked up. There's not a lot else to figure out here. We've got censuses going year to year. That's the agricultural census. This tells you what they were doing on the property at various times. We also found several Pennsylvania Historic Resource Survey forms, which is a precursor to a submission for a National Historic Register nomination. And several of them were done. This property, because of the funny style, this is what some people call a German continental plan, a stove room plan, a Flurkuchen house. There's a lot of different names for this style of house, but there are very few that are quite like this done in stone. There's the Jonathan Hager house in Hagerstown, Auntie's house in Montgomery County, the Kaufman farm out in Ole, but there's a handful of houses this style. So people had studied it quite well and done a lot of documentation. Well, here's the problem. See that number? 1734-35. That is a different number than it says on the outside of the house. Why does it say that? There was no deed on the property. How could that be? Well, this timber, which is also in the basement, was felled in the spring of 1736. The first guess was that it was reused from something. Okay, nobody was there. That town wasn't founded for another 40 years. The first person credited with being in this town was the neighboring property, and that person settled there in 1741. We're way before this. So what's interesting about dendrochronology is where it tells you to look in the documentary record. That is ultimately what we ended up finding. Scheme for a lottery. This was the 1735 Pennsylvania land lottery, where William Penn's horrible, rotten, awful, no good children lotteried off several thousand acres that did not belong to them. 7,000 tickets at 40 shillings apiece. And this land is actually part of what later became the walking purchase, which arguably is another theft. So this land, our property now, is twice stolen at least. But we never would have known this without the dendrochronology. There's the original lottery land map, and that's our property right there. That's it. We never would have known to look for that otherwise. That's it. Questions?
I was just going to take questions from the audience. Just give me a second.
I thought I got rid of this thing.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was very interesting. I just like to see if there's anybody that has questions.
This process takes a weekend. So what are we looking at here? Timeline.
It could. So the question is, this isn't a simple process that just takes a weekend. My answer is, well, it could. It won't, but it could. Generally speaking, I tell people to plan on me being there for a full day just to do the sampling and documentation. We need to make sure we are clear on where each sample was taken from. Preparing 10 samples, 2 hours, 3 tops. Marking them off, maybe another 3 hours. Measuring them, maybe, depending on what the samples look like, I could measure off 10 samples easily in a day, but some are more complicated than others. And sometimes I'm looking at 80 ring samples, or in the case of our house, we're looking at 170 plus or 250 plus rings. So it clearly takes more time to measure those. And then you get into the analysis. I am essentially an underling for the Oxford Dendrochronology Laboratory. I'm still learning. And so all of my work is double checked. I send all the prepared cores off to Oxford, and the fellow that I work with corroborates all of my findings. So you'll never get a peep out of me until he says, yep, you got it. So far, I've nailed them all, but I don't think I'm out of probation yet.
I'm told that oftentimes years ago, because timbers were valuable, one structure would be taken down and used to start another structure. Wouldn't that throw off dating this building and the property?
Yes, absolutely. That's part of the, so I don't know if everybody caught that. The question is, what about reused timbers? And that's something I am always on the lookout for. Typically, I can spot most reused timbers most of the time. I have a pretty good confidence in myself. I've worked as a preservation timber framer since '96. I've been doing this for a while. I know what the work looks like. I know what the layout looks like. And I know when you find errant layout. And that's usually the giveaway, is that you're looking at timbers in a frame and you find here are markings or mortises or joinery details that don't appear to relate to the rhythm of the house. You've got a mortise here and there should be another one over there, but there's not. That sort of thing. Particularly in northern New England, where J. Frederick Kelly, Norman Isham, folks like that were working in the early 20th century. They were notorious for taking parts of first period houses to repair other first period houses. So I have been hyper vigilant about looking to see, is there a fresh saw kerf on something? Was wood cut when it was dry as opposed to green? So you really do have to look for those kinds of details, but it's also another one of the reasons why we're taking 10 samples per phase at least, so that you get that kind of repetition, not just in the signal and the data, but in the results, so that you say, I took 10 timbers out of that house, and I don't know if you noticed, there were a couple where there were funny dates that didn't match. In that barn in Lambertville, there was a timber that had been added in the 19th century. I sampled it on purpose, just for the data. I knew it was added later, but you're right. It's something that we always have to watch for and be super vigilant about.
In the case of looking at documentation, for instance, this building there was a building here in 1840 that burnt down, and then it was rebuilt. So if somebody said, well, this is built in 1840, and you check the wood, it's not going to come out right. I mean,
generally speaking, yes.
I was curious about the date from the Westminster Abbey pig door.
What about it?
Yeah, what was the date? What was the ultimate? Oh, did you say what the date was? I didn't. Oh, maybe you don't know.
Yeah, 1050? It was before 1066,
Yeah, right.
I can tell you that. I say it was either 1050 or 1060 or 1055, something like that.
That must have thrilled a lot of us.
I know it's a point of pride for the laboratory. I don't think anybody else has a Saxon door to boast about.
I attended a lecture about Lambertville, and they went back to, well, what was the first industries in Lambertville? And the main first industry was, well, let's cut down all the trees, put them in the river, send them down to Philadelphia, and they'll make houses and furniture from it. So when you're looking at a house in Philadelphia, I'm just wondering if it's a tree from Lambertville, is that an area that's so far away that it may not match up?
Well, this is why, I mentioned when I do the testing, I can see Alex is behind you. Alex knows a lot about rafting. This is pretty common. We've actually found houses in Virginia built with timbers from Maine. Stuff moved far. And so it doesn't take me any extra time or effort to test multiple chronologies. And that's what we're looking to see, is where are we getting the strongest hits? So if I'm looking at something in Philadelphia, I'm probably testing against chronologies that go all the way to Canada and as far south as Georgia, just to see how well things match over the varied regions. And we'll find that a lot, especially if you were looking at structures here in this region in the mid-19th century that were made out of hemlock. Chances are it came from upriver, and it could have been some distance. But because of the data set and how wide it is, it doesn't really matter to us if something was 200 or 300 miles away, but it'll probably be borne out in the results where you say, well, the structure is here, but the matches are from up here.
Okay. I had a second question too. Yeah. When you take a sample, do you do a stain? Do you stain it to make it look more visible to help you count?
Oh, stain the sample to make the sample look more visible?
Yes.
No, I haven't had to. I think probably mostly because I'm working with oak. Even the marker that I use is enough that sometimes it washes out. So I have really nice lights with my microscope, and I can usually play with the light on the microscope to get some more crispness when I'm looking at the samples. If not, I've also got that trinocular head with a camera on it. So on the computer, I'm able to do a lot of manipulation, but I tend not to stain them.
So do we have any questions from anyone online?
Thank you, Michael. Just a quick question. If you have this large data set, tell where timber comes from and things of that nature. Do we know how, any studies been done to see, where timbers that has been harvested, where it's gone to, like the traveling, the history of the industry for harvesting timber, let's say here in this area? How much may have been used here for local structures? Maybe some of it shipped off down to Philadelphia, like Alan said, things of that nature.
I wouldn't be surprised if the data and the studies were out there. Nobody's commissioned us to look for it. And I think, over the years of giving various presentations, people ask a lot of good questions about, have you studied insects or, where the timbers have gone? We study what people, if the question is, how old is this house? That's the question that we're looking to answer, and it tends not to go much further than that. With migration of timber in particular, it tends to be the case that the most migrated timber is when you're getting into the 19th century, which is about the least period of people are less interested in dating 19th century houses. Most folks that we run into are dying to know, do they fall on the 1799 side? Like the difference between 1799 and 1800 to a lot of people is devastating. Somebody would be just crushed if their house was from 1800 and they don't have a 7 there. It's a heartbreaker. So most of the people that we're working with are either looking to show that it was 18th century or in a lot of cases 17th century. We had an interesting project a couple of years ago. The Massachusetts Historic Commission, in anticipation of the 400-year anniversary of the founding of Plymouth, commissioned myself, Dan Miles, another friend of ours, Bill Flint, who does dendrochronology up in Deerfield. They asked us to go sample all of what were believed to be the extant 17th century houses in Plymouth and Marshfield, Massachusetts, that had yet to be dated. And a number of these were house museums with plaques out front boldly declaring this is the only house in Plymouth where pilgrims actually ever lived. No, it wasn't. Almost all of them ended up being 1705 to 1715. I think that was the spread that we were getting. And that's what most people are asking us for.
With your colleagues in England, just a follow-up question. Colleagues in England, they can actually place shipbuilding materials back from North America, right? There's a lot of harvesting and shipping.
I don't know if everybody heard that question, that we're able to figure out the origin of various materials, if we're looking at shipbuilding or something like that. There are people who are studying shipwrecks almost exclusively. One of the big problems in the United States is that if you are building a ship, you are not including sapwood, and we have no provision for dating it. So you'll get, some sort of terminus post quem. You'll get a last ring counted, and well, it certainly couldn't possibly be older than that. But that's as much as it will give you. But it will give you what region something is in. So recently we had a wonderful project. There was a panel painting that J.P. Morgan had donated to the Met. And it was believed that Queen Elizabeth herself had sat for it, the first. And the Met had it for a number of years. They deaccessioned it, and then it came up for auction. Somebody who currently is employed at J.P. Morgan Chase bought that panel painting for $126,000. He wanted to see if we could shed some light on the provenance on that thing. And so with that one, we had a sapwood, heartwood boundary, assumed that it certainly isn't an American piece of wood, and we should be able to figure this out. And so it ultimately ended up being determined that that piece of wood was from France. I think they had thought at first maybe it was Baltic oak. It turned out that it was French oak, and it did indeed come from the correct era. It's not a guarantee that she sat for it, but it does lend credence to that speculation. And so, there's an example of where you're in one country, but you're looking at data sets from all over the world. And our National Ocean NOAA, that organization, publishes all sorts of climate data that we are able to use in dendrochronological study, and people use all over the world. One of my favorite examples of dating something to a country where it shouldn't have been from was Anne Boleyn's bed, right? And if anybody is interested in owning this hideously ugly bed, it can be yours for $28 million. And so the owner of this bed decided to have it provenance by doing dendrochronology work and engaged the Oxford lab to do so. And they said, well, funny thing, it appears to be from the early 20th century in New York State. So naturally, that means we're quacks, we're kooks. We made it up. This is not to be trusted. So we went to another dendrochronologist, had that fellow look at it, and they said, funny, it really looks to be from New York State in the early 20th century. And then he decided, well, dendrochronology is just junk science. Let's do AMS C14 carbon dating, which gives you a range. And the fellow said, well, as near as we can tell, it looks like it's from northeastern North America, right around the early part of the 20th century. So that guy's a kook too.
So Michael came to my house, and I live just down the street, and he couldn't do mine because insect damage. Is that why?
There were a couple of factors. One, I could see that it was relatively fast grown. And a lot of the material that we look at here is going to be what we call boxed heart, where, as the heart is in the middle of the tree when it's on the stump, when you square it up and make a timber, the heart's kind of close to the middle of the timber, which means that if you are taking a core from the outermost arris toward the center of that timber, you're only getting, this distance instead of this distance. So knowing that, looking at yours, I was guessing we would be struggling to get 50 or so rings. Real problem is that there was a lot of decay from powder post, and that I knew that the sapwood was really not likely to hold together. So if we don't have intact sapwood, at least for a few samples, then it's going to be really hard to give a felling date. So again, you could give last ring counted, and you could say, oh, it's after such and such. But my guess was you were looking at timbers that probably had 46 rings, a dozen of which were destroyed, that they would turn to dust when you hit them. So we actually were really good about telling people, we don't think you should spend the money on this. We don't think it's going to work. I know Benita's house in particular, that was a risk. Benita decided to take it, and she won. And I'm very glad that it worked out that way.
What Michael and Virginia did instead was walk through my house and opine on the nails in the floors, the molding, and everything. And when it's funny you say about, everybody wants it to be $17.99. Like, we were told when we bought it that it was $17.50, which we thought was ridiculous because it wasn't $17.50 here. I mean, somebody would have said something about the house when George crossed. But based on the nails, it's after 1819.
Yeah, it was probably after 1820s or so.
And then I know enough from doing research that couldn't have been between 1820 and 1830. So it really was a Titus house. It really is Titusville. It's not the guy who there's a bookmark back on the table that says it's the Knowles General Store. It wasn't. And then we did Krista's house, which was about the same, about 1833, right?
33, 34, yep.
Yeah. It just adds to that knowledge. And we're just so excited to know, we wondered for so long about what it is, and now we know. It's so cool.
I will point out the two fellows back there, Alex and Elric. Invite them over. They can tell you about your house.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Michael. That was a fascinating program.